Good afternoon. Welcome to Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. Welcome to the debate today. My name is Darren Smith. I'm a pastor here in Kansas City. It is my privilege to welcome you to the debate today of Does Human Suffering Make Belief in God Unreasonable? Big topic for election day, but it is a debating day, so why not have something theological too, right? So that's what we'll do today. Before we get started, we just want to thank some special guests that are here with us today. First off, thank you to Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary for the opportunity to use their space here. And thank you once again, if you'll give me a round of applause for the ladies that served our lunch for us. Also to Dr. Tony Preston and Vanette from the Clay Flat Baptist Association. Thank you all for hosting this in some sorts, and thank you all for being leaders in that as well. Our participants today in our debate are people who are known to you for many reasons at different various points. Mr. James Morgan is here. He's a former pastor in the St. Joe area who's since left Christianity. He's now part of the Clergy Project. He's joined by his wife Michelle today and some other visitors with him. And also on the other side, Pastor Eugene Curry of Park Hill Baptist Church, who has been a pastor at Park Hill now for a couple of years, I believe. Eugene, is that correct? 4 years. Yes, it's already doubled in time. That happens. So our format today is very simple, folks. I am the glorified timekeeper. I have 2 toddlers at home. We use this all the time. So if it works on them, it will work on grown men, right? So it works just as the same. We will start out today with opening statements. Those will be 20 minutes. We'll start with James here in just 1 second. After that, both debaters will have a rebuttal statement of about 10 minutes apiece. And then we'll go to some directed dialogue, some questioning back and forth one to another. And then we'll end with 5 minutes of closing statements apiece, followed by some Q&A with the audience. So be preparing your questions as they become available. So without any further ado, I will go ahead and ask Mr. James Morgan to come up this way for his opening 20 minutes. Best of luck to you guys.
All right, so they've set up some sort of mirror so I can see the slides, but is it blank? Is it blank right now? Yeah. Okay, now I can see it. All right. Super, now I can see that much. That's great. All right. So it was March 12th of 2013. Chris Drennan was an off-duty LAPD detective. He got home from a long shift. His wife was out of the house. She was celebrating a friend's birthday. He relieved the babysitter and he took his place on the sofa and began to unwind. His 7-year-old daughter was asleep not far from the living room. And while sitting there, still having his weapon holstered, he heard a noise, a strange noise, sounding like heavy footsteps coming from his daughter's room. He went to investigate the noise, opened the door, walked in. A man had come through the bedroom window, was standing over his daughter's bed. His pants were undone. He was holding a knife. It was clear what he was about to do. Chris Drennan is a big man, 6'2", 215, ex-Special Forces. What do you suppose that Mr. Drennan did with this man who was clearly up to no good? Would it surprise you if I told you that Mr. Drennan pulled up a chair and did nothing at all? He sat down simply to watch his daughter be sexually assaulted. Why would somebody do such a thing? Well, before you judge him as being some sort of monster, you should know his reasoning behind his choice. Firstly, he did not want to violate the man's free will. This man, this perpetrator, this intruder, he has the choice to be good or to be evil, to do what is right or to do what is wrong. Who is Mr. Drennan to interfere in such things? You certainly don't want to force that man to be a robot and compel him to be perpetually good. The second reason that Mr. Drennan did nothing is, this is how it has to be. This is how the world works. Bad things happen. And so it has to be, because if you're going to have light, then you must also have darkness. And if you're going to have the existence of something like a hug, then you also must have the existence of something like a punch. And Who is he to fight against such things? It's the way the world has to work. And where would it end? If he stopped every bit of wrongdoing, he'd never be off work. He'd never be at home. He'd be perpetually out trying to force people to do the right thing. It didn't seem prudent to him. Thirdly, Mr. Drennan did not stop the sexual assault of his daughter because something good could come from this. He's a good dad. He has the ability to help his daughter through this. There's a very good chance she could become a rape crisis counselor, perhaps become a psychologist and help many people. There's certainly many good ways that this could become a redemptive act. Fourthly, Mr. Drennan's a believer, and he understands that really in heaven, all of this will be made better. How do you compare this present suffering to the glory that awaits? And so a few moments of pain and humiliation, degradation, is really nothing compared to billions of years of joy and bliss. So in the scheme of things, in the scope of things, this is really a slight, trivial matter. And then lastly, Mr. Drennan didn't stop the sexual assault of his daughter because he knows things that he can't even tell us why. His special training, his experience on the job, there are things that he knows that you just can't simply comprehend. So before you judge him as being evil, you have to understand that he's privy to knowledge you just don't have. And if you knew what he knew, you'd be completely fine with it. Now something happened as I was telling you this story, right? At the beginning, you thought I was telling you a real story. It's got details. There's no reason not to believe a guy up young wearing a tie and behind a pulpit, for crying out loud. Why wouldn't you believe me? But when I got to the part where this loving father with the power to stop wrongdoing chose not to, you instantly knew that it was a setup, that it was not true. And the reason why you knew this, and if you didn't know it instantly, I'm sorry for you. If you didn't know it instantly, you knew it by point number 1 or point number 2. I mean, you just realized there's no way that any loving father would ever allow the rape of his young daughter. Never. There is no reasonable explanation for such a thing. And so the moment you began to hear these reasons, you realize they're not really reasons. It doesn't make any sense. No one would ever do that. And that's why I want to talk to you about the Book of Mormon and South American land animals. Am I on the right slide? Can you see the Book of Mormon?
Yep.
There we go. I know how you guys love it. I did for many of you. We have a lot of Christians in this room, no doubt, and I would imagine that most of you, like me, for over 20 years, find the story of the Book of Mormon to be unreasonable, more than likely. Some of the things that the Book of Mormon puts forth is that Heavenly Father lives on or near the planet Kolob. It's not entirely clear. Let's just say he lives on the planet Kolob. You also can become a god and have your own planet. That's also true. Jesus and Satan are spirit brothers. It's something also that's taught in Mormonism. And I would say that most of you would find those statements to be unreasonable. But it's very difficult to prove that they're not reasonable. I cannot prove to you that God does not live on the planet Kolob, and you can't really prove it either. But one of the things that we can do, rather than trying to tackle these heavenly ideas, spiritual ideas that we can't really touch or taste, we can talk about the history of the Book of Mormon, which is much easier to debunk, at least in my opinion. The Book of Mormon is supposedly a book about prophets and people who lived on the American continent 4,000 to 3,000 years ago, right? 4,000 to 3,000 years ago. And Joseph Smith wrote this book. And one of the problems, the many problems with the Book of Mormon, is that Joseph Smith, he wasn't an extremely educated man. He didn't know much about the world or history. He wrote into the Book of Mormon the fact that sheep and goats and cows and horses existed in the Americas thousands of years ago. And what we know about that is that it's complete and total hogwash. There is absolutely no evidence that that's the case. He got his timing way, way wrong. In fact, in 1998, the National Geographic Society stated they were unaware of any archaeological evidence that would support the Book of Mormon. Interesting. So what do you do when your sacred text says something that is patently unreasonable? That's a good question, right? When your holy book says something that is clearly unreasonable, what do you do? What do you say about that? Well, well, this is my picture of horses, or at least I think a horse's hoof is what I can see. I'm assuming the rest of the horses then. What do you do when it's unreasonable? That's my slide for unreasonable. This is I'm catching up. It's very important that my slides are right. You know what I can see is my hair, and it looks marvelous. Is there a guy up there? Yeah. This is what you do when your sacred text is patently unreasonable. You bring out somebody successful and smart and well-spoken and well-read. You put them in a tie and you give them a podium, and you let them talk about how it's not really, truly unreasonable. This is Mormon apologist Robert R. Bennett, and his claim to fame is that he suggested that in the Book of Mormon, where it talks about horses, that it was a mistranslation, and that the Book of Mormon is not actually saying that there were horses and that Native Americans rode horses. Mr. Bennett has provided the explanation that the horse was really this creature, a tapir. And that what the Native Americans rode were not horses, but in fact, tapirs. Can we just stop for a minute and kind of laugh at that? How about laugh at this? Now, he's a smart man. He's an educated man. He's a successful man. He's a religious man. You might think that his argument is unreasonable, but I assure you there are millions of Mormons who do not. They think that it is completely reasonable that Native Americans rode tapirs. In just a few moments, Pastor Curry is going to come up here and he's going to tell you a tapir story. That is exactly what is about to happen. You know that it is completely and totally unreasonable for any loving father to allow the sexual assault of his child when it is in his power to stop it. There is not a single loving, powerful father that you can think of that would ever, for any reason whatsoever, allow his child to be raped if he could stop it. It is unreasonable to suppose otherwise. And yet, Pastor Curry is going to come up and he's going to use a lot of words. He's going to use big words. I have no doubt that he's smarter, well-read, and better looking than I am. But they're just going to be words. And he's going to try with all of these words and complicated arguments, and he's going to try and make you believe that it's reasonable that an all-powerful, all-loving God exists and allows children to be raped. That's exactly what's about to happen. Now, what you have to understand when you take the position that there is an all-powerful God who is all-loving and omnipresent. He's everywhere, he sees everything, and he's all-loving and he's all-powerful. That means that every time a child is sexually assaulted, in the room, there's Jesus. And Jesus sits in the room, and he watches, and he does nothing. Oh, maybe 1 out of every 100 times. I have no numbers to back it up. I have no clue how often. Let's say he intervened 1 every 25 times. I think that number would probably be high. So 24 out of every 25 times when a child is being degraded, sexually assaulted in the most evil, horrific manner, Jesus sits there and watches. And that's the God that you've created. I don't mean to be insulting to Jesus. I loved Jesus for 22 years. I loved him with all my heart. I gave my whole life to him. I've moved from my home to Missouri. I was a missionary to the Philippines. I was all in. The problem is not Jesus, so to speak. It's the idea of Jesus. Theologians have painted themselves into this corner where they've supposed a God that is all-powerful, and some prophet wrote that down, and everyone went, yeah, that's awesome. And then someone else wrote down, and he's all-loving, and they went, yeah, that's awesome. And then they didn't realize what they'd just done. And he's everywhere, he's omnipresent. Yes, that sounds great, but boom, you just created Native Americans riding tapirs, is what you did. Because if you created a God who's all-powerful and all-loving, but does nothing while kids are being abused, you have created something that is so unreasonable so as to not be true. So, wrapping it up, what's on the slide now? Anything good? There's a bed there. That's awesome. All right. I don't know. All right, I think that's all I got time for. If you don't think that it is unreasonable, then am I going the wrong way now? This is the worst thing ever.
You are going backwards.
You're going back.
Sweet. All right, we'll just stay there. I want you to remember you laughed at this picture. You laughed at it. And you laughed at it rightly, because it's just silly. This is what you have to come up with in order to justify a position that is unjustifiable. So here comes Eugene with a whole bunch of words, quotes, and scriptures. It's going to be awesome. And at the end of the day, he's going to try and convince you that Native Americans were the takers.
Does human suffering make belief in God unreasonable? James says yes. But for that to be true, there needs to be something about human suffering which is plausibly irreconcilable with the idea that God exists. And the thinking here is normally that if God existed, if there was such a being as God, he would prevent human suffering. But human suffering is out there, it's ongoing, therefore God is clearly not preventing it. Therefore, God is not existing, and therefore we know that, and therefore to believe in him would be unreasonable. The foundations of this argument is the more moral or general moral belief that a being who is morally good and who is able to prevent human suffering will consistently do so, at least to the extent that the being is morally good and able to do so. Without this more general foundational claim, the atheist argument about God is just special pleading. As such, we can imagine the atheist case here as a kind of structure. At the foundation, you have the general claim about what good agents will do to prevent suffering. On top of that foundation, you build an argument about what God will do to prevent suffering, but there is still suffering there. And from that argument, you derive the conclusion that belief in God is therefore unreasonable. This is going to be a fun reversal of roles for me today, because today I get to play the part of the skeptic. I get to wear my little skeptic's hat and to kick back and say, when it comes to that foundational belief that undergirds all the rest, I just don't see any reason to believe why that would be true. In fact, it seems to me that that is obviously false. As such, in my opening statement, I'm going to try to do two things this afternoon. I'm going to first poke holes in the argument for that general belief at the foundation, to show how it fails, how it is a little bit like leaky buckets, shot full of holes. From a distance, it might look like it can hold water, but when you get up close, you realize it all just leaks out. In my second part, I'll be a bit more ambitious. I'll lay aside my skeptic hat, and I will make a claim of my own. I will argue that, if anything, human suffering doesn't make belief in God less reasonable. It makes belief in God more reasonable. So, let's get started here, focusing in on this argument. As I said, James's argument is rooted ultimately in the idea that a morally good agent which is able to prevent human suffering will do so. But surely this is just false. Morally good agents allow humans to suffer all the time, even when they could prevent it from happening with ease. We can choose lots and lots of different examples of this, but for the sake of simplicity and time, let's stick with just one. Let's stick with the example of morally good parents. Morally good parents allow their children to suffer often, even routinely in the course of their life. And when this happens, they generally allow it because they believe that the suffering that takes place is part of a package deal that includes great goods that are enough to justify and compensate for the suffering, so that the package deal is seen to be worthwhile. Now, we can consider how this plays out in daily life. For example, most obviously, morally good parents allow their children to suffer when they deserve it, when they punish them for having been poorly behaved. And they feel that the suffering here is justified by discipline and by limited notions of justice. Morally good parents allow their children to suffer when their children don't deserve it even, as when good parents, as opposed to meddling helicopter parents, refuse to fight every last one of their children's battles for them, against schoolyard bullies or unsympathetic teachers, believing, as they sometimes do, that allowing the children to fight their own battles will result in greater character growth and independence of that sort. Good parents allow their children to suffer physically when they allow them to enroll in things like PE and they're ready to run a mile. And in those moments, the parents believe that the physical suffering there, the aching legs and burning lungs, is justified by the health benefits of exercise. Good parents allow their children to suffer psychologically, as when they allow them to enroll in projects, and then, when the kids are kind of flaky and want to drop out ahead of time before it's all done, they don't permit it, requiring their kids to stick with it till the end. And the child complains and feels grief and suffers psychologically, but the parents feel that this suffering is justified because of the greater sense of work ethic and emotional resilience that will come as a result. Parents even allow their children to suffer in ways that the children cannot possibly understand. Let's consider inoculations here. When a child is inoculated against polio, from the child's perspective, this is nothing but meaningless, purposeless pain. But from the perspective of the parent, a more well-informed perspective, the parent feels the suffering is justified because of the greater disease resistance that comes with the shot. In all these examples and countless more, we see that morally good agents allow humans to suffer, sometimes actively cause them to suffer, because of the great goods that they believe come with the suffering, regardless of whether the suffering is deserved or not, whether it is physical or psychological, or even when it appears pointless from the perspective of the one who actually suffers. So, with all these things in view, clearly that foundational belief that undergirds the case of James and others like him is utterly shattered. And if the foundation is shattered, not only does it crumble, but everything that's been built upon it crumbles to the ground as well. And we can see how these kinds of reasons, the same reasons we've seen that allow parents to permit their children to suffer, might motivate God to allow his human creatures to suffer. Now we should be clear, there are differences here, but the differences are largely a matter of scale. Immensely greater goods, potentially justifying and permitting immensely greater suffering. Sometimes people choose to do terrible things to one another. The sexual assault here in our story. But, as he points out, the ability to choose how one will live, what one will do with one's life is, whether we like it or not, an implication of free will. Free will is a great good, and perhaps a good God would feel that the package deal of suffering that results from abused free will and the good that comes from free will used well is worthwhile. Similarly, people that believe in God often feel that God permits suffering in a very straightforward way when he disciplines people with behaving poorly, when they are jerks and they are called to account. In this instance, while suffering is bad, things like justice are quite good, and a good God might allow the package deal to stand because of the great good that justice is. We can look at classic examples even that are sometimes put forward by skeptics seeking to debunk the reasonableness of belief. Things like the suffering that comes from earthquakes and tsunamis and stuff like that. But scientists tell us that these terrible tragedies that cost the lives of thousands are rooted in the operation of plate tectonics. At the same time, these same scientists tell us that plate tectonics are also responsible for things like the large-scale recycling of minerals on the planet's surface and global climate control. So much so that without plate tectonics, complex life on the Earth would be impossible for more than a few million years. So, if we consider a package deal that includes the terrible suffering that comes with earthquakes on the one hand, and the very existence of mankind as the compensating good on the other, surely it seems to me that a good God might allow that package deal to stand. We can also look at additional supplementary matters. The suffering in our world, terrible and tragic as it is, does allow for the expression and cultivation of certain grim virtues, what are sometimes called martial virtues, that could not meaningfully exist without the possibility of suffering. Things like bravery and endurance, self-sacrifice, and heroism of various sorts. These virtues make people better and make our world richer. And it's possible that a God would feel the package deal that includes these personal enrichments would be worthwhile and therefore allow suffering so that it might exist, at least as a kind of secondary consideration. But what about gratuitous suffering? What about sufferings for which we can see no good reason? Well, I would submit that here in these instances we may find ourselves in the position of the infant being jabbed in the arm with a needle, as he's vaccinated against polio. Again, from the perspective of the child, this is just meaningless, pointless pain. But of course, that's simply the ignorance of the child, a reflection of its own limited cognitive capacity. When it comes to the parents who know more and better, they feel that they do have a good reason to allow this thing to happen. And it may be the same with God. If God were to exist, then as an all-knowing being, we ought to expect that there would be things that he knows that we, as people who are not all-knowing, would not. Perhaps things which, given the enormous cognitive gap between what he can do and what we can do, things that we don't simply not know, but things that we could not know, which we could not understand, no matter how much time was spent trying to inform us. So it is entirely plausible that God might have perfectly acceptable reasons for allowing all sorts of suffering which we are simply unaware of. This is, in fact, the entire message of the biblical book of Job. In the book of Job, Job looks out upon a world and sees what he believes to be signs that things are not as they should be. It's as if things are out of control. It's as if a good God were not running the show. But at the end of the book, when God appears to Job and reminds Job of his own limitedness and God's massive competency by way of contrast, Job comes to see that his ignorance was only ever that. Ignorance. Not knowledge that there was a serious problem. As he says in Job 42:3, I have declared that which I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Job came to recognize that he was simply not in an epistemic position to know whether or not the things he saw in the world were evidence against God's good governance. Now, I want to be clear that all the things I've said so far are just possibilities. It may be that only some of these explanations would apply to some forms of suffering, and other explanations would apply to other forms of suffering. And some forms of suffering would not be justified by any one of the explanations, but might be permissible if we consider several explanations bundled together, none of which would be sufficient on their own, but which taken together would motivate God to allow what we see in the world. It is a veritable smorgasbord of possibilities. And it is precisely because there are so many possible escapes from the problem of human suffering, so many holes through which the argumentative water can leak out, that we see that the arguments of people like James and those like him simply cannot be relied upon in the end. As we've seen, the arguments, when we place them into dialogue with the kinds of things that we know about good agents we're familiar with, and the kinds of dynamics that are at work in our world more generally, these arguments then simply don't hold up. They make assumptions which seem to be dubious. They gloss over counterexamples which are obvious, and the arguments just generally fail to prove their case. Well, so much for skeptic Eugene. Now on to the Eugene who's willing to make a claim of his own. It seems to me, as I said, that not only does human suffering not make belief in God unreasonable, if anything, it might make belief in God more reasonable. Now, there's a method by which people can compare and contrast competing theories, competing hypotheses about the world. And that is to consider what kinds of expectations a given hypothesis might lead us to have about the world, and then comparing those expectations against observations made of the actual world around us. And when you have two competing hypotheses, you compare the gap that exists between the expectations of both of those hypotheses and the reality before your eyes. The smaller the gap, the better. The bigger the gap, the more of a problem. And if you have those competing hypotheses, the one that has the bigger gap is in more trouble. The one with the smaller gap is, relatively speaking, confirmed by observation. And we can apply this kind of thinking, this kind of approach, to questions about God and the reasonableness of belief in light of human suffering. But before we do so, I really need to draw attention to something that's quite important. Questions about human suffering are exactly that. They are questions about human suffering. And so when we ask ourselves what we would expect concerning human suffering, given theism or the alternative, atheism, we have to ask about our expectations concerning, one, the existence of humans, and then two, their likelihood of suffering. Now it seems to me that on theism, on the belief God exists, we have very good grounds for thinking that human beings might very well exist. even independent of observation, refusing to cheat by skipping ahead, considering the theory God exists, it seems that we have good grounds to believe that might actually happen. After all, the theory God exists is, as James has pointed out, the theory that there is a being who is omnipotent and omniscient and perfectly good and loving and all the rest. Now it seems to me that a perfectly all-knowing being would know how to make humans, or something very much like humans. An all-powerful being would have the ability to put any kind of plan to make them into action. And a being which is all good, indeed all loving, might do so for no other reason than because it is a nice and loving thing to do. To create beings to enjoy themselves, to enjoy existence, and to enjoy their maker. And as we've seen, it does seem to me that if God were to make beings like human beings, we have reason to expect that he would allow them to suffer to at least a degree. That they might grow in terms of their character and demonstrate courage and other kinds of virtues and so forth. But I do want to be honest here, because I want James to be honest. I recognize that there is something awkward here. Because when I consider what my expectations of human suffering would be on theism, while I would expect human suffering, I would think it would be a rather modest kind of human suffering. I might expect that God would let a boy break his arm in the midst of an adventure to show courage. I might expect that God would allow someone to miss a few meals to teach them a lesson about how next time they really need to plant their fields and harvest their crops rather than while away the time. Responsibility is important. But when we look at the actual world around us, we don't just see people with broken arms missing dinner. We see things like the Holocaust. We see things like terror famines that cost the lives of millions of people. We see things like tragic sexual assault. And so it seems to me, if I am honest with myself, that there is a fairly substantial gap between my expectations concerning the amount of suffering on theism and what I observe in the world. And that's, I think, a problem. One that Christians and other believers in God should face honestly. But we still have to do the other side of the question. Yes, when we consider our expectations concerning human suffering given theism, there is a gap. But what about our expectations concerning the alternative? For the alternative theory to God exists is the theory God does not exist. Now again, not cheating, not skipping ahead to look at observation just yet, just considering our expectations. What would you expect concerning human suffering? The existence of humans and then their suffering, simply on the theory God does not exist. It seems to me, if that is all we have to go on, atheism considered on its own, I have no expectation whatsoever that human beings will ever come into existence, let alone that they will then go on to suffer. And so it seems to me that while on theism, I would expect human suffering at about a level 4. On atheism, I would expect human suffering at about a 0. I just wouldn't expect it at all, because I wouldn't expect humans at all. And therefore, while there is a gap that separates my expectations of human suffering on theism from the observation of the world around me, the gap is only much greater when we're considering atheism by itself. And therefore, if gaps count for anything, and I think James and I both agree that they should count for something. I don't think he's crazy. I think he's recognized there's a problem here. It would seem that the problem is only greater for atheism. And therefore, since atheism is being embarrassed to a greater degree, since it is being disconfirmed to a greater degree by observation, it would seem to me that theism, the belief that God exists, is rendered by contrast more reasonable and not less. So, to bring it to a close here at the end, it seems to me that since James has rather courageously stepped forward and sought to make the case that human suffering makes belief in God unreasonable, since he is making the affirmative case, he bears a burden of proof here in this debate. But as we've seen, arguments that seek to make belief in God unreasonable in light of human suffering simply cannot meet that burden. There are far too many rational escape hatches waiting for us to use them should we desire to do so. And indeed, since the gap that separates expectation from observation is greater on atheism than on theism, it seems to me that if anything, and perhaps not anything, but if anything, human suffering makes belief in God more reasonable, not less. And so in the end, when all has been said and done, and we've both said our words, and we've both exchanged our rhetorical blows back and forth, it is simply not the case that human suffering makes belief in God unreasonable. Thank you.
At this time, we'll have James come back for his first rebuttal statement in 10 minutes. James, 10 minutes.
You want to continue the recording?
No, that remote betrayed me. That was a total setup. I made on some of those slides, and I had such great slides. Big slides, huge slides. Before you got that. Oh my gosh. During the 20 years that I was a Jesus-loving, Bible-believing Christian pastor, one of the things that I believed and I taught was that people live out what they believe. People will live what they believe. And you've probably heard this if you go to church, right? Show me what you do, and I'll show you what you believe. So you can tell me you believe in supporting the local church, but if you never write a check, what do you really believe? Right? You can tell me that, well, you get the idea. You can tell me that, we should not forsake the fellowshipping of the saints, but if you only show up on Christmas and Easter, then we know what you believe, right? We can see your theology by your actions. Is that a fair statement in a room mostly full of Christians? Absolutely. All right. So it's with that principle in mind, I'd like to point out again that Eugene, with all due respect, we did a great job. I mean, I've taught that message many, many times. Man, he's at a disadvantage. I was in that position for 20 years. I've taught, and I've had to defend human suffering. It is not easy to do. It sucks. It's basically indefensible. But you get as good a job as anybody can do. But he had to do exactly what I told you he would do. Words. Maybe it's like this. Maybe it's like that. Maybe it was a tapir. Maybe they rode tapirs. You can't prove that they didn't ride tapirs. Tapirs are wonderful to ride. They've got that cushy pig-like body, much more comfortable than horses, and on and on and on. It's just words, and you know it. You know it. I'll prove it. Imagine if right now a voice came over the public address system informing us that a child had just been abducted by a known sexual predator. Campus authorities been alerted. Bad guy on campus. He just took a 5-year-old little boy. We know what he's done to other little boys. It's horrific. He's somewhere in this building. They've got it cordoned off. They've got it closed down. He's somewhere in this building. What would you do if that announcement came over the public address system right now? Would you continue to sit here and listen to this debate? Would we sit here digesting our chili, acting as though all of that's fine? No way. We would be monsters if we didn't stop exactly what we're doing right now and do everything within our power to stop the abuse of a child. If we say that we buy into this argument, and because he gave all those reasons, right? And with all those reasons, if God is okay with allowing the rape of a child, then, and you believe that, I mean, essentially, if you're believing his argument, what you have to concede is sometimes suffering is good, because God is good. And if God allows suffering and God is good, then we can allow suffering and still be good, right? Because I want to act like my God. I want to be like my God. I want to emulate and imitate him. So if he sometimes sits around and does nothing but has got great reasons for it, if we truly believe and buy into those reasons, then we also can sit and do nothing. But that's crap and you know it. You would not do that because it's unreasonable to suggest such a thing. Ridiculous. We would get up and do everything to prevent that from happening. Show me what you do, and I'll show you what you believe. Every one of you, if you had the power to stop human suffering, you would. Now, getting to some of the reasons why Eugene says that God doesn't, right? Number one, essentially free will, right? God, God to make us into robots. I used to teach that all the time, right? I'll bust out all my old sermons. My sister had a doll. You pulled the string, it goes, "I love you," right? But it would say it to anyone. Like Saddam Hussein could pull the "I love you," you know? It doesn't mean anything. It's a robot. So in order for God to experience true love, He wants us to love Him. He wants to have a loving relationship with us. He cannot make us robots. And so therefore the idea is that, well, God can't override someone's free will. Oh, really? Why don't you read your Bible? Old Jonah doesn't want to go to Nineveh. And God says, oh yeah? Has him swallowed by a whale. Man intervenes on the laws of nature and violates the guy's free will. He said, well, it didn't make him. Well, if you swallow me with a whale and spit me up, I'll do whatever you want. That's a violation. That's coercion. That's a felony. Right? He violated the laws of nature and his free will to make him do what he wanted to do. Balaam wanted to go talk to King Balak. God didn't want to do that. What's he do? He puts a flaming angel in front of him to stop him. Balaam's too stupid to see it. The donkey sees it. God he manipulates the laws of nature to make a donkey not only talk, but apparently be able to reason too. Somehow now it has a prefrontal cortex. Amazing. And so God is really into stopping prophets from prophesying or making prophets prophesy. But when it comes to the rape of a child, and you're like, why do you keep harping on that, Jim? You know why? Because he wants to talk about vaccines. Wouldn't that be nice if we just kept the subject to that? If we acted like the only suffering that goes on is when your parents make you do your homework, or you broke your arm, or a vaccine. Let's just get to the heart of the matter. Let's talk about the stuff that really matters, the horrific stuff that goes on. Something is horrendous as a child rape. God won't stop that? He's got angels at his disposal. He can make donkeys talk. He won't stop that? And you say there's a reason for it? I say it's unreasonable. And what about heaven? If you can't have the ability to choose and still live in a perfect environment, then what the heck is heaven about? Is everyone a robot in heaven? I mean, clearly if heaven is true, then God has the ability to make people who can choose and still not be robots. That's what the whole story of heaven's about. You mean to tell me God can't do it, but yet He's going to do it? The other argument is that God, did not create the world this way. It's not His fault. The world has to be like this. In order for there to be life on the earth, there has to be plate tectonics, right? And so poor God's hands are tied. There's nothing He can do about it. So insulting, I think. And no offense to you, I taught the same thing. Sometimes I just go like, what the heck was I doing? It's like, well, God, anyways, hold on, I don't want to get off track. If you were to beautifully, the classic argument is, well, God didn't create the world like this. God created it perfect, and He put perfect people, and so all the problems are what man has done, right? God's not responsible, it's just man that's done it. Well, imagine I create a perfect room, and I decorate it perfectly. And it's pristine, it's beautiful. And all the furniture is perfect, the lighting, the wall color, it's all perfect, and it's all light colors, very nice. And in this perfect room, I put 4 perfect glasses of grape juice. I would say wine, but we're at a Baptist Theological Seminary. So go grape juice. It's less controversial. It's okay to laugh. It's all right. Put 4 glasses of grape juice in the room, and then I put in 4 perfect little 4-year-olds, into which we all say, wait a second, there's none that does good, no, not one. They're the original sin, whatever. But as far as humanity goes, they're super cute, and they're great. So I create my perfect room. I put my perfect kids in the perfect room with the glasses of the grape juice. What do you think's going to happen? And when it happens, can I say, not my fault, it was all perfect. Perfect kids, perfect room. If they destroyed the place with grape juice, that's not on me, that's on them. BS. Sorry, I'm getting fired up. This stuff makes me... I'll tell you in a minute why it makes me so mad. The other idea is that, suffering can lead us to God and bring about good. That's an interesting argument. So why punish anything, right? I mean, if one of you guys who's really on fire, you love Jesus, you're born again, right? If I stab you in the leg, I shouldn't be punished for that because God's going to use that for good. And this present suffering is not worthy to be compared with the good that awaits. So why should I did you a solid, right? Basically, the whole argument is that evil is good and suffering is awesome. I love that. The other argument is that God's ways are not our ways. I love this, right? That just God knows stuff that we don't know. So He's super smart. If we were as smart as God is, then we would do the things that God does. I tend to believe that smart is as smart does. Do you have the pictures still up? Do you have my slides available? Can you go just the ones of the kids? You know which ones I mean. Just show me a few pictures of the kids. Yeah. God did that. Because he says in Exodus 4 that he makes the blind and he makes the deaf, right? So God takes credit for making kids with disabilities. Look it up, every translation. He makes that. Next slide. He makes this, he made that, that's his handiwork. Right? Next slide. Yeah. See, God's really smart. He's so smart he can't figure out how to create a world where that doesn't exist. His hands are tied. The world has to be like this. In order for the plan of salvation to be true and for him to have a loving relationship with you and his loving son, kids have to be raped and babies have to be born like this, and darn it, he just can't figure out another way to do it. You know, we want people, if you're a motorcycle rider, the law requires that you wear a helmet. It kind of messes with the experience. But we don't want to clean up your brains off the highway. So we want you to be able to enjoy a motorcycle, but we don't want you to become meatloaf. If you're in a car, you got to wear a seatbelt. That means I'm winning. Right? You got to wear a seatbelt because it hinders the experience, but you still get to drive. Playing baseball, you got a catcher has to wear a mask. It kind of messes with the catcher's experience, but at least you still get to play baseball. We as humans figure out a way to still let you do something, but we put limits on it where we say, yeah, well, you can't go too far. We don't want it to be too bad. But the God that you've created can't figure out how to do that. And so in his world, kids have to be raped, babies have to look like that. And darn it, he's just not smart enough to figure out how not to do it that way.
All right, 10 minutes. And I will grant it is difficult to defend human suffering and God in context of it, no doubt. But I will note that my opponent hasn't actually engaged in my argument. He said nothing about the expectation of human suffering on atheism, as an alternative to theism. He's skipped over that in favor of emotional cues, showing you photographs of sad things. It's kind of like the rhetorical equivalent of saying, you believe in X? Come on, it's 2016. That isn't actually an argument. Showing you photographs of kids that are suffering isn't actually an argument either. When it comes to the argument, the rational, intellectual approach here, it seems that I'm holding all the cards. Now, he does say a few things, and I do want to try to engage with him as best I can. He mentions the story about Chris Drennan. Is that right? All right, we'll go with that.
My childhood neighbor.
All right, Chris Drennan. Chris Drennan, who allows the man to rape. And he says, you know, if Chris Drennan said that he had good reasons to allow this, reasons that we just don't understand because he has the training and so forth, so maybe he has knowledge that we don't, we wouldn't accept that. I think he's right there. I don't think I would accept that. Because Chris is not that different from me. Chris's cognitive capacity, his ability to know things, might be a little better than mine, but not by much. And as such, when he does something or allows something that seems to me obviously problematic, I'm not inclined to trust his perhaps marginal increase in cognitive capacity when he says that he has justification for it. Now, though, imagine that Chris is not a cop, but that Chris is some kind of science fiction supercomputer that can see through time and knows all possible histories of the universe. And that being then allows this to happen. At that point, if Chris, the science fiction supercomputer that can see through time and knows the multiverse, says that he had reason to allow this, wouldn't you be a little bit more inclined to maybe take his word for it? I recognize it's a little silly using sci-fi examples, but speaking for myself, if there was an ever-increasing gap between my cognitive abilities and Chris's, that gap would translate into a greater willingness to kind of take his word for it. Similarly, when James mentions how Chris doesn't do this because where would it end? Where would it end if God was intervening at all times to stop human suffering? Well, we can kind of follow that line to its logical conclusion. Where would it end? I guess if God was going to stop all instances of human suffering, we wouldn't be allowed to think freely. Because after all, our thoughts can cause us to suffer, and can cause those around us to suffer when we withhold love and so forth. So if God was really going to stop human suffering in toto, we wouldn't even be able to think harmful thoughts. We would indeed become those little dolls when we pull the string, and just repeat meaningless words that are supposed to mean that we love somebody, but actually mean nothing at all. Now, let's say, James mentions how what I have intended to say is just words. Well, I mean, on some level, sure, I'm not up here doing a dance. It is just words. But everything that James had to say has also been just words in this sense. And all my arguments are just arguments. Well, what would he prefer I do? Build a house of cards? Do the luau? This is a debate. It is a thing that centers on words and arguments. If he feels that to be inadequate, I think that he may have signed up for the wrong event. Similarly, when he says that we act in accordance with our knowledge, and therefore if we heard that a kid here was abducted by a sex predator, we would get up and do things to try to rescue that kid, and that therefore that shows us that we really believe that these things are bad things that ought to be prevented, I fully agree. I don't deny that. Each of us acts in accordance with our views, with our beliefs. And it seems to me, as I've said, that one of the reasons that God doesn't necessarily intervene in every conflict is because it allows an arena in which we can act. And therefore, if I were to hear that there was someone who was suffering here who could perhaps be helped by my intervention, I would do so. I would intervene. And in doing so, I think that I would be living out one of the great purposes that God has allowed for us to exist within an interactive arena in which we can help and harm one another. Let's see. James says that in the Bible, God has no problem overwhelming people's free will. What he doesn't, though, mention is the ratio. James is willing to grant that maybe something like 1 in 25 or 1 in 100 possible rapes are thwarted by God's intervention. Something that's perhaps a little bit too low for us to capture with statistical analysis. I think it's very generous of him. But if that's the case, if we're dealing with God overwhelming people's free will in the Bible, that's mentioned on maybe a half a dozen occasions. And the Bible chronicles what? 4,000 years of human history? That's a whole lot less than 1 in 25. So if he's willing to grant that God might stop 1 in 25 rapes, I don't see how 1 in 25 million instances of God intervening in the world is somehow a counterexample. It seems to fit quite nicely there. Let's see, he mentions how God can't do certain things, like make a world that doesn't have plate tectonics. I didn't say that God can't do those things. I think there may be a disagreement between James and myself about what God is obligated to do. My statement was simply that God, when he allows bad things, plausibly does so because there are great goods associated with them, so that the package deal is taken as a whole worthwhile. I'm not really sure that we can know that God is in some sense morally obligated to do the best of all possible acts. That's an interesting idea, but then again, I'm not sure that there are best of all possible acts. There are certain logical problems that come with that. Imagine creating the world the way it is now. It's a pretty nice place. But imagine if it was the way it is now with just one more banana split. It'd be a better world, and therefore creating that world would be a better act. But then again, if you had it with 2 more banana splits, that'd be an even better act. 3 more banana splits, that's an even better act. And you can just keep adding banana splits ad infinitum, so that there really is no best possible action, because there is no best possible world. You can always throw 1 more banana split on top of the pile. It seems to me then that since the idea of a best possible action is quite plausibly self-contradictory, it's unreasonable for us to expect God to do the best possible act if all such acts are themselves logically incoherent. What else? James spends a lot of time arguing against notions of the fall. I didn't say anything about the fall. James spends a lot of time arguing against ideas that God might be trying to bring people to know him through their suffering. I didn't mention anything along those lines. So in addition to not engaging in the arguments that I've actually shared, James has chosen instead to engage with arguments that no one has shared here today. He's choosing to go tilting at windmills and kind of waste his time. So, I've got a few more seconds, but I don't really know if there's anything more to engage with. Oh, one more. James mentions that the idea of a good God allowing terrible suffering is absurd. It's crazy. And on some intuitive level, we can know that that's nonsense. Do you know what else we can know on an intuitive level is nonsense? Wave-particle duality, time dilation, and all the other exotic fundamental physics that surround things like quantum mechanics and general relativity. Unusual, bizarre, counterintuitive realities are a dime a dozen in the universe we actually inhabit. If James wants to live a life where his worldview is dictated by his gut level reactions to the world, he's going to have to go back to about 1770. That's not the world that we actually live in anymore. Science has moved beyond that, and if science can call us to believe in implausible and, in some sense, counterintuitive realities, I don't see any reason why our theodicy and theology cannot follow suit. Thank you.
All right, at this time, we are moving to the stage of the debate where we will have what's called directed dialogue. This is a time for both of the participants to ask each other questions and for them to respond appropriately. So, James, if you guys want to scoot up just a little bit here and come a little bit closer. James, we're going to give you 7 minutes to ask any questions you may have, direct dialogue to Eugene at that point, and then at that time, that great buzzer, if we go over, will go off, and likewise for you as well, Eugene. So, James, whenever you're ready, we'll go ahead. Yes, I believe so.
Do the questions have to be directed just to Eugene, or can I ask for the chili recipe? That was marvelous.
We can get you that afterwards, but before Eugene, please.
But don't be promising anything.
Oh my goodness, where do I start? Just out of curiosity, it's not a deep question. Do you think it's reasonable that Native Americans rode tapirs?
I would say no. I think in light of what we know about, military dynamics and stuff like that, I'm not sure that a tapir is a really fitting animal. I don't see any cultures that rode tapirs when the Europeans showed up. It seems that if it had been an established practice, it would have carried forward into the cultures of the time. And so Europeans would have shown up and had to engage with militarized tapirs, and they didn't.
Why do you think so many Mormons believe that?
Because I think that all people, believers in God and not, try to persuade themselves of their own reasonableness. And so they will hold on to their beliefs and require evidence that goes above and beyond the normal standards.
Is there anything that I could say or anything that could be done now, today, in this debate that would cause you to change your position?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, if you could have a successful argument, I'd change my mind.
What might that argument be?
I don't know, that's on you.
Somehow I doubt that.
You are free to appeal to your own personal incredulity.
When was the last time you changed a significant theological position?
Sure. Man, I feel like a ping pong ball when it comes to questions of predestination. I kind of sit back and forth across the table on that one every few months. I would say that when it comes to origins, I moved from a young earth creationist perspective away from that back in college and later in seminary. I would say that I've become more open to certain figurative interpretations of certain sections of Scripture. So there have been pretty sizable shifts in my theology over the course of my life.
You stated in your rebuttal that I am using, I'm arguing against things that you've not said, and I think you said something to the along the lines that no one is using.
No one in this room has said.
No one in this room has said. So that would make me think that your goal today is to simply win an argument and not give these young people truth.
No, not at all.
Because isn't it true to say that the arguments that I used are common arguments within Christianity?
They may be, but they're not the arguments that I presented today.
They may be. Again, see, and this is what's bothering me.
Sure.
Because these are lives here, and what they believe matters. What they believe is going to determine who they marry, whether or not they marry, where they live, what jobs they live. Some of them might be attracted to people of the same sex. They'll spend their whole lives having people like you telling them that it's wrong and evil. And so we're talking about real lives here, and I feel like you're playing around with words. For you to say that the arguments I put forth are like, where the heck did you get that? No one's ever said that. When you know full well that those are common Christian arguments, you're just playing around with words, and that's what I mean when I say you're just using words. So tell me, those arguments that I shared, were any of them new to you? That you've never heard somebody say that before?
No, they're not new to me. But then again, I never said that no one has ever said those. I said that no one here has said that.
Yeah. Why'd you say that?
Because it's off topic for the debate.
Like you wanted to debate evolution, which you're like, let's talk about the existence of humans. That's not off topic. Why didn't James take up my little?
That topic. You were the one that requested the topic be human suffering. I didn't.
Well, actually, that's not true. That's neither here nor there. You're trying. You want to get into a debate about evolution, or you at least want me to take that debate or that bait, and then you turn around and say, "Boy, he's acting like he's afraid of that." I feel like you would. I feel like you just want to win a war of words and you're not really concerned about their lives and what it means for them to embrace the things that you're teaching. Go ahead and wax eloquent on that.
Sure. Okay, I was going to wonder if there's a question yet. Yeah, I think you may have misunderstood me. I'm not inviting you into a debate on evolution. I'm willing to concede the consensus view of scientists there.
James never talked about why humans exist. That's creationism. That's origins.
I'm not suggesting they're not creation. I mean, I suggest that we debate the problem of evil. You specifically requested that we change to human suffering. So it seems if we're going to be dealing with human
I did
suffering,
do that, he's right.
if we are going to be dealing with human suffering, that's going to require us to ask ourselves what we would expect about human existence in the same way the question about rubber chicken would require us to debate, rubber. It's going to be mixed up in the whole package. And I'm not suggesting that.
Would coming out as an unbeliever put your family in any financial difficulty? You're a full-time pastor, correct?
Yeah.
What would it cost you financially to decide that all of this is false?
I mean, I'd probably have to go get another job.
So you have to do that quickly and easily?
Quickly, easily enough. I mean, I don't think we'd starve, but it would be a burden for a while, yeah.
What about relationships with family and friends?
I would probably put a strain on them.
In Exodus chapter 4, God takes credit for making the deaf, making the mute, not being the sight. Why is it not I, the Lord? Would you ever personally make a child be born with such an extreme out that they can't close their eyes?
Would I do that? Yeah. I would think not.
Can you think of a reason why anybody would?
I mean, I would say that it's probably being driven by the liability of DNA to copy itself imperfectly, which is a terrible, terrible thing. But at the same time...
Well, God says He made them that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's His process. He puts it into place. But I mean, again, as a package deal, the liability of DNA to copy itself imperfectly, we're told, is the whole driving force of human existence in the first place. If DNA didn't copy itself imperfectly, there'd be no mutations, there'd be no natural selection, there'd be no evolution whatsoever, and so we wouldn't exist. So if we see it as a package deal, cleft palates are terrible. Cancer is terrible. I got people that are dying of cancer in my church right now, but it's a package deal, along with the very existence of humanity itself, as science seems to imply. That seems like a worthwhile package deal.
So, the rape of a child, what would have to be in the package deal to make that worthwhile?
Sure. I think that some of the things I mentioned...
What's the cost? What's the price for the raping of a young child? What's the deal on rape?
I think free will is a pretty good.
Unless you're the child or the parent.
I mean, do you think that if you were to approach the children who've been made to suffer in that way, they would prefer a world that lacked free will?
I think that they would prefer not to be raped. And
well,
I think
I'm not disputing that.
Where rape does not exist. Well, but you minimize that argument like, well, you all have had this gut reaction to a child being raped. Why don't you have the same gut reaction to, what was the list of sci-fi, Star Trek?
No, I said that if the person who allowed it to happen were genuinely, massively more cognitively...
Yeah, but you equated the argument of like quantum physics to the rape of a child.
Oh, yeah,
I think you're being disingenuous, and you're trying to put one over on all these kids with a bunch of big words and clever arguments. And I think they see through it, and it's sad.
All right. Thank you, James. Eugene, you have 7 minutes to question James.
Sure. James, do you want to engage with the argument that I've actually put forward? You've got 7 minutes.
No, I believe that I have.
What would you expect? What would your expectation be about the emergence of humanity and then their subsequent suffering, just on the basis of the theory God does not exist?
Hey, if God doesn't exist, the world's going to be a sucky place.
Is there a world? I mean, is the world?
So you don't want to argue the origins of life, but now you want to.
No, I'm saying. I mean, it seems to me that.
What debate do you want to have?
I want to know what you would expect, just given the theory God does not exist.
Hey, let's say that God created the world. Okay. So, but let's say he's an a-hole. What if it's Zeus? What are we arguing? Are we arguing about the God of the Bible, or just God in so I'll concede. Yes, a God created all of this. He created humans. He created the world. But I would also argue on the basis of what we see, he's a bit of an a-hole.
So you are conceding that, then?
I'm being rhetorical.
Okay, all right.
I'm saying, what does it matter? It doesn't matter, Eugene, if something created us, if we popped up out of nothing or created by aliens. None of that matters. You're arguing for the God of the Bible who is all good and all loving. The fact that the crap that I just showed on the screen and talked about happening to small children, the fact that I exist flies in the face of the God of the Bible, not just God in general.
But you have to actually argue for that. You can't just assert it. And it seems like you haven't been able to
It
successfully
doesn't
do that.
bother me that you don't think my arguments are good. That's your job.
But what's the argument? It's not that I don't think your arguments are good. I'm not sure what the argument is.
And if God is all loving, all powerful, it's unreasonable. He would not allow small children to be raped.
But you're just reasserting your position, not actually arguing for it. I mean, it's like me saying a God that's all loving, all powerful would allow children to be
You know
raped.
what?
Case
All
closed.
of these high school students right here, they're all laughing right now at Eugene. They're amused by that because it's as clear as day to them. So you got to be a pastor a long time. You got to read a lot of theological books to confuse something as simple as what I'm saying and make it seem like, well, gee, James, I have no idea what you're talking about. Maybe you could argue your point. I think my point's super clear. In fact, it's so simple, crystal clear that you wish it wasn't. You wish we were talking about tsunamis and the Holocaust and vaccines. It'd be great if we discussed all this and where humans came from and evolution. I'm not doing any of that. I'm saying that you as a dad, was there any situation in which you allow your child to be raped? Any whatsoever? Give me a reason.
I would say, given my cognitive position, my epistemic position, I would say no. But
Cognitive epistemic position.
But I would say that I don't have God's all-knowing position, and so I don't have.
Yeah, he's really smart. Yeah, that's your thing, is that he's just super smart. If we were as smart as he is, then we would let kids be raped, and we would let kids be born deformed. It's too bad we're not as smart as God is.
Are there no instances in your life where you would allow your children to suffer to any degree that they, in their reduced position of knowledge, would not allow?
I think your vaccine argument's awesome. I used it for years. It's great. We're not talking about vaccine.
So the principle is sound.
Well, as you said, there are instances where some argument matters in some cases. Yeah, absolutely. But you know what? My kids, they're now grown. They had vaccines when they're younger. Now they can say, hey, Dad, what was that all about? And I can say, hey, here's exactly what it was. Sure. You know, the thing is, God isn't showing up. And how many of you have been visited by God recently? How many of you have had your questions answered face to face? Is he? Did you physically see him, young man?
I'm joking.
Okay, very good. Yeah. Well, it's safe for me to ask that. See, you say that if I would just argue it, that your position could be won over. I think that you're being completely disingenuous, and that's putting it nicely. I don't think there's anything that can be said here today, not a single thing that can be said here today that would get you off your feet, because you are so invested in Christianity, and you've made this your whole life. I know what it's like to have done that.
Okay.
You have to defend this stuff. And somehow a bunch of prophets, so-called prophets, painted you into a corner. That now you have to come up with all of this crazy, complicated, well, maybe it's like this, maybe it's like that, and you hope that all these poor kids get lost in your barrage of words. See, they're going to do what the Mormons do when someone talks about tapirs. They look at you and they go, well, this is a really smart guy. I don't understand half of what he's saying, and you don't. And I don't understand half of what he's saying, but that's why he's so much smarter than I am, and that's why I should listen to him. It's the thing that perpetuates ignorance, continually. It's sad.
So if we can skip over all the ad hominems you just threw out. You did conceive the validity of the principle that I laid out. That parents that know more than their children will sometimes allow them to suffer in ways that kids would not themselves.
What I did not say is that parents will allow their kids to be
Okay,
raped.
but the principle that I laid out, would you concede that is valid?
With vaccines, yes.
So with the principle?
Sure, whatever.
So the principle is valid. So
Yeah,
it's not a
he's
matter of
trying to-
application.
See what he wants to do? He doesn't care about you. I really care about you because I spent 20 years of my life wasting it. And I'll never get it back. I'll never get it back. Well, and it's sad. And he just wants to win some sort of verbal sparring. And I guess that's what a debate is. You're right. What do we think we're going to do? That's fine. I've never been in a debate before. So I had to watch a bunch to prepare for this one. I hate them. It's all this. It's ridiculous. Nobody's really caring about truth. No one's really caring about these ideas and how they play out.
So are you suggesting that
I don't
argument
see.
is not a way to approach truth?
I think it is, but I think your arguments are disingenuous and convoluted and
Whether they're disingenuous or not is not really not relevant. It's whether they're valid, whether they're sound.
I don't think they're sound. I think they're unreasonable.
Well, then point out the flaws.
I think that's what I just. Well, sure. Which ones? The fact that God has to make the world like
I
this?
didn't say he has to. I said that he chose to. Or he could have chosen to do so, and therefore the fact that it is the way that it is doesn't make it unreasonable to believe it.
I think it's unreasonable to say, as you just pointed out, God chose to have children be raped, but he's a wonderful guy. I think that's unreasonable.
But you need to show an argument for why that's the case, and you're just consistently reasserting your position.
Well, maybe I'm a simpleton, but guess what? I think it's unreasonable to believe that there's an all-loving, all-powerful being that allows children to be raped. Shame on me. It's that simple for me.
If you've got nothing else to say in way of argument, then I guess I should see my time.
Don't give up those 20 seconds, Eugene. Speak to the people.
I think you've said enough. Okay.
Thank you, guys. At this time, we will go to closing arguments. That time was a special time for you to see the dialogue between. Now we get to the more formal closing arguments, 5 minutes apiece, so that each one can come up. James, as usual, you will be first, followed by Eugene, 5 minutes.
I'm a simple guy. I am. I didn't graduate high school. Went to a cheeseball Bible college, 18 months. They taught me everything I needed to know about the Bible. And I went out into the world and I planted my first church. I was less than 3 years old as a Christian, 27 years old as an adult, and I went out and I started teaching the Bible verse by verse, Genesis, Exodus. I taught verse by verse through Leviticus. You know what easy? It's not easy. That was in the mid-90s. Man, I loved Jesus. And I needed it to be true. I wanted it to be true. And I was a zealot. I had my bracelet like almost everybody did in the mid and late 90s. It said WWJD, right? They say, anyone still wear those? Yeah. What would Jesus do? That's a great question. And Eugene doesn't like this argument, and he thinks I'm not making an argument with it. No, you're smarter than I am, Eugene. Poor simple me. But in a room where a child is being sodomized, what would Jesus do? He'd sit and watch. Tell me I'm wrong. If he's omnipotent, omnipresent, the eyes of the Lord see the evil and the good, then he sits in a room and he watches. And Eugene says, but I've got all these great reasons why he watches. And poor simple me just says, that's sick. And he says, well, don't try, you're just going to go through life trusting your gut? You get to go through life trusting the arguments of people that say Native Americans rode tapirs into war? I mean, come on. He's told you a tapir story today. And he has to, I get it, he has to. He's a pastor, he's a Christian, he's invested. I want to talk to you high school students. You're not totally invested yet. Some of you probably come from Christian families that would hurt your parents for you to change your beliefs, but stop, think about what is being said here today. Don't leave here saying, well, who had bigger words or who seemed smarter? I'm going to lose that every time. Which one just struck with you as true? Which one, when you look around at the world, makes sense? Gave up 20 years of my life preaching something. It took me 20 years to get out of it because it cost me everything. That's why I asked Eugene about what it would cost you to leave. It cost me everything to leave Christianity. It destroyed so much. It was so hard to do. But at the end of the day, I just couldn't do it anymore. I just couldn't, in good conscience, pull the wool over people's eyes anymore. And honestly, I believe that's exactly what he's trying to do here today. He's just trying to win an argument. He doesn't really care about. He's trying to hijack your lives with religion, and it's reprehensible.
Well, there's certainly been a lot of words spoken, some of them on topic. I think, though, at the end, with all the things that have been said, all the ad hominems thrown at me, all the reassertions and reassertions and reassertions of positions, it's good to come back and to focus in on the actual argument, because I, for one, think that argument is a good way of approaching truth. It may not be infallible, but it's the best that we've got. And while I think that James has done, as I said, a fairly heroic effort here, trying to represent the case that he wanted to represent, I don't think that it works. Because as he says, the principle that I've laid out, he concedes is valid. That those who know more will sometimes allow suffering than those who know less, for the reasons which they know and others just don't. Now, he doesn't like the idea of scaling that up scaling it up to the level that we see in the world. But again, that's a kind of gut level reaction. We might say that he has on some intellectual level a fear of heights. He doesn't want to go that high with the principle. And that's fine, he doesn't have to. But that isn't any reason for you not to do so. His own unwillingness to follow the logic and the evidence where it leads is his problem, not yours. And as we've seen, when we consider that principle applied on large scales, it would potentially allow God, even a good God, to permit the kind of suffering that we see in the world, when that suffering is seen to be part of package deals, which involve great goods like free will or the existence of humanity to begin with, and all the rest of it. Now, I do not want to just kind of skip over emotion. I mean, I think it's unreasonable and inappropriate to make them the centerpiece of this case, but that is still part of our lives. How we respond to things around us, how we feel about the world. So it should be brought in on some level. And so I think that in addition to offering you just words and just an attempt to win an argument, which is the whole nature of debate, I do want to offer something which seeks to hit us not simply in the mind but also in the heart. Because as a Christian, I'm not simply here as a general theist, as he points out. I am here as one who believes the gospel specifically, and I wish that I could hold out to you not just an abstract argument for the reasonableness or the non-unreasonableness, rather, of belief in God, but for something deeper and more existentially satisfying. Yes, as I admitted, we live in a world where there is a gap between expectation concerning human suffering, given theism, and the way the world actually is. But on Christianity, that gap is not something which God observes safe in the remoteness of his transcendence. Instead, Christianity asserts that in the person of Jesus, God has, on some level, in some way, entered into our experience and chosen to face the mystery of that gap alongside us in solidarity with us. To quote from the British novelist Dorothy Sayers, "For whatever reason God chose to make man as he is, limited and suffering and subject to sorrow and death, he has had the honesty and the courage to take his own medicine. Whatever game he is playing with his creation, he has kept his own rules and played fair. He can exact nothing from man that he has not exacted from himself. He has himself gone through the whole of human experience, from the trivial irritations of family life and the cramping restrictions of hard work and lack of money, to the worst horrors of pain and humiliation, defeat, despair, and death. When he was a man, he played the man. He was born in poverty and died in disgrace, and thought it well worthwhile." Here at the end, as I said, I hold out to you not simply an intellectual rationale for why God might allow what he allows. I hold out to you the picture of Jesus, a God who suffers with us, walks with us, as a brother, as a Savior, that we need not face the mystery of that gap alone. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Eugene. And at this time, we will take some questions from the audience. Guys, yes, if you guys want to scoot up just a little bit. We'll have a roving microphone at this point. If you have a question, we can get that microphone to you. And gentlemen, we will take questions for about 20, 30 minutes. Is that okay for you guys? All righty. I will just start up front. I see a young lady here, and I will walk with you, and we will talk with you. So guys, be ready. And please say, just say your first name and say who the question is for generally.
Okay, my name's Eliza. It's for James. I just was wondering what made, you said you were a pastor for like 22 years, so I was wondering what made you leave, or like what was it that made you go away from the church?
Yeah, so as a young person, I was given all of these evidences for the Bible being the inerrant, supernatural Word of God, and the evidences were compelling and impressive. I mean, they were so amazing that I left everything and everybody I knew to move across the United States. I'm from Orange County, California. I moved to Northwest Missouri. Nobody does that unless they love Jesus with all of their heart and soul. And then, and as a young person, I had to listen to people like who I became. I mean, Eugene, and I don't mean just any disrespect, but there's a guy, he's smart, he's more educated. What the heck do I know? I don't know about ancient civilizations and cultures and all these words and these theological statements. I don't know. So you listen, and so what you end up doing as a young person is you're simply just parroting what someone else has said, and you kind of do that. But something happens over the course of 20 years of studying the Bible verse by verse. And I was a part of a group that basically a Baptist church, and what was happening over 20 years is little by little, things that I thought were true weren't. And so the way I describe it, you have two folders in your head, as every Christian does, right? You have a folder where you keep all the things that affirm your faith, right? Things that make you feel like, yes, Jesus loves me and he exists, and then you got that folder. You have another folder that contains stuff that you don't really understand, like why did God command all the babies to be killed in that village, right? You don't know that. So you put that in the folder, which is, I'm going to wait for more information. When I get to heaven, I'll figure that out, right? But the thing that makes that folder bearable, the fact that God does some stuff, like why do kids get raped? I don't know. I'll put that in that folder. Why does my daughter have cerebral palsy and live her whole life in a wheelchair? I'll put that in that folder. But that folder can exist because I have so many things in this folder that build my faith. But what happens through studying the Bible, and I wasn't reading atheist literature. I didn't know any atheists. I lived in a Christian bubble. I just simply read Christians. I began to just ask the question because I wanted to be a good pastor. I wanted to be a good teacher. I didn't want to parrot anymore. I wanted to really understand these issues. And the more I studied, without me even knowing it, over the course of 20 years, things were going from the faith folder to the I don't know folder. And on November 12th, 2012, it was the final piece that went from the faith folder to the I don't know folder, and I realized I don't have any reason to believe that any supernatural being wrote this book. I don't have any reason to believe that this is the inerrant, inspired word of God. And it floored me. And I was as shocked as anybody. I hope that answers your question. So through studying the Bible is the short answer.
Thank you. To make sure we get equal questions, does someone have a question for Eugene? Question for Eugene. Yes, sir. Say your name.
I'm Josiah. I had a question about your 3 charts of expected suffering.
Sure.
What was the atheist expected suffering? It was none. What was the reason behind that?
Yeah, it seems to me that on atheism per se, simply on the theory God does not exist, I don't see any reason to expect that humanity would exist at all. I don't see any reason to expect that anything would exist. The theory is so stark and so threadbare that there's no reason to expect the existence of anything. And so I don't expect the existence of humanity, and therefore I don't expect that they would suffer. Now, one can, of course, complicate that picture by saying, well, we're not going to stick with atheism per se, we're going to go with materialism. But then you have to ask, well, what kind of material? Well, okay, fine, material that kind of corresponds generally to a universe of suns and stars and planets and so forth. And then you can bring in the argument from fine-tuning the laws of physics, and it can get more and more and more complicated. But because I only had 20 minutes, I had to make it as simple as possible, so I stuck just with straight theism and straight atheism. It seems to me that on straight atheism, without supplementing it with complicating features that render the a priori probability of the theory less, there's no reason at all to expect that humanity would come to exist.
All right, a question for James or Eugene. Let's start.
Jim, some of the greatest atheist minds in the world believe that we are just meat machines. There are no moral values because we are just human meat computers designed to propagate and so on and so forth. Because of that, moral values don't really exist. But the reason your arguments are so gut-wrenching is because all of us know objectively, anywhere in the world, it is wrong to rape a child. That is an objective moral value that evolution cannot explain. The moral argument states that if objective moral values exist, or if there are no objective moral values, God does not exist. But because there are objective moral values, then God does exist. Don't you think that the strength of your example being universally true anywhere in the world, not affirmed by atheists as being a moral statement, proves that there has to be a lawgiver? And also, I want to just say to the teenagers really quick, when there is suffering and pain in the world, It is the church, the hands and feet of Jesus, who come to care for and minister to those people who have suffered. I just want to give those 2 cents as well, since he gave some 2 cents on that.
I would say, to your last point, Calvin, I said that for years. We're the hands and feet of God. Has no hands and feet but ours, right? But that's exactly what you say to your kid when they catch you putting the change under the pillow for their tooth, right? Yeah, what's happening? What are you doing? Well, you know, the tooth fairy has no hands and feet but ours. I mean, it's what you have to say for imaginary creatures. That's why you have to put the presents under the tree. Santa's not going to do it, right? It's a cop out, I think, with all due respect. I don't think it holds water. Now I want to get into the sea of morality. Let me just say that religion doesn't help you find an absolute morality. If it does, why are there so many denominations? Give me a break. Some people say absolutely it's worship on Saturday. Others say absolutely worship on Sunday. Some say you got to have your head covered. If you're ladies, you don't have your heads. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 says you all should have your heads covered. Why have you not taken that passage seriously? Oh, is that just cultural? You choose not to take that. Well, other people think that you're immoral for doing it. There are some apostolic, Pentecostal apostolic churches who think you're totally in sin for not having your head covered right now, except for you. Right? And so don't act like the Bible is the end-all for determining what's moral or what's not. Because in the Old Testament, it was perfectly moral to wipe out a village full of babies, but in the New Testament, it's not. So it's, you know, my morality is what makes for human well-being. And I don't think it's ever in the interest of human well-being for a child to be raped. I think at the end of the day, that's where we all, as thinking people, have to start. Because we can all agree on that. Do we want human well-being? We do. So let's create a society that brings about human well-being. And let's not act like if we just were more religious and took the Bible more seriously, that it would be more clear. Because it would not. And we all know it.
Gene, I'll give you a minute and a half for this one.
Yeah, I don't know, a minute and a half, I'll go quick.
This is your topic, man. You've been dying for this.
Well, no. I mean, I think that response misunderstands the question. I mean, he wasn't saying that having a religious perspective gives us absolute morality. He's saying that from a philosophical position, the existence of a God would allow us to ground morality in a way that is objective. So that if there was no God, we couldn't ground objective morality. We'd only be left with our subjective opinions. And even if we all agreed on them, it'd still be subjective. I mean, we find
It's
it.
the best we got.
Is it?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. But I'd love to see you figure out your morality in a room full of, let's get a Hindu and a Muslim and a Jew, and you guys can all work on figuring out your morality on the basis of God. It's not going to help you one iota. The best thing we have for all of us, because we all have to get along, we all have to get along. I don't care who you voted for today. And one thing I know, if you voted today, I know who you voted for. You voted for some idiot. That's true, right? But we all have to figure out a way to get along. We're not going to do it with our religious books, folks. How's that working out? We need to do it by just figuring out what we can agree on, which is human well-being matters, for whatever reason it matters.
All right. Let's go to our next question. I'm going to get the gentleman in the back with the camera. He's had his hand up for a long time.
Thank you. Gene, a follow-up question on your slide on the gap.
Yeah.
So the position of atheism on there, you're kind of coming from, you're saying that there are no humans, there's not humanity?
In the slide, again, trying to use the most simplified, most straightforward, time-saver way that I could, I was saying that we're talking about simply the theory of theism, which would be that God exists, taken entirely on its own, and then considered what would we expect simply on the basis of that theory, taken in absolute isolation of all our observations.
Okay, so if we take that from
atheism, do the same thing.
Right, so if we take that from a kind of a different perspective,
Yeah.
we're all here in this room, we're all humans,
Sure.
okay? So what we're really asking is there a God who created humans, or is there not a God and we're just here?
That one can pursue it that way.
Okay, so if we pursued it that way, then that gap for the atheist is a 10.
No, I would say that would be very different. I mean, if we can make it much more complicated, as I said earlier, we can go with a much more sophisticated kind of Bayesian approach where we have, initial probabilities and then a posteriori probabilities, and we can utilize
We'll all love this.
Yeah.
That sounds great.
Yeah, it's complicated. And we can bring in background knowledge, and we can choose to bracket off certain observations and make them just given background knowledge. And definitely, I would agree, if we're willing just to kind of say that the existence of humanity is just a given, that we're bracketing off from consideration, then absolutely, if it's bracketed off, then I think atheism really does well with human suffering. There's no doubt about it. But I think that's of course jumping over an enormous part. I mean, that'd be, I'll make it up. Let's go with O.J. Simpson. Let's say that no, let's bracket off all the evidence that points to him having done it, and now consider one small piece of evidence that might point in a different direction. Well, if we do that, then yeah, the evidence will point in a different direction. But it's a rather artificial way of approaching the matter because you're bracketing off huge swaths of the evidence.
Ladies, I can give you a minute and a half. Would you like to respond to that?
I disagree. I mean, do humans exist? Yes, we're here. Does God exist? We don't know. So does the world look more like a good and loving God exists, or there is no God? I would say the world looks exactly how you would suppose it would look if there was no one running the show.
So you would suppose, if there was no one running the show, that the laws of physics would be just what they need to be to allow material existence, and that the material existence would be just what it needs to be to allow for the emergence of life, and that would evolve in just the way it needs to evolve to bring about rational, embodied, sentient creatures.
Do you think that things would evolve to not be alive?
No,
They have to evolve
these are multiple steps. But no, they don't have to evolve the dynamics we have. They didn't have to. That seems logically
I have
possible not
no
to have.
desire whatsoever to debate evolution with you. You do it
No,
all the
I'm
time.
accepting.
Nothing can bore me more.
I'm not disputing the reality of evolution. As I said, I'm willing to defer to the consensus of scientists. It seems to me that, given again the consensus view now of physicists, that our physics even, are incredibly finely tuned so as to allow for the emergence of rational, embodied, intelligent agents. Is that likely to happen just willy-nilly if no one's running the show? I think not. So I think that you are skipping over.
I think that you're calling evolution willy-nilly is being disingenuous again. So, next question.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to somewhere. We have not been back in this corner, so I'm going to go back this way. Would anyone like to let the lady in the back go first? Okay, all right. We'll take her. Yes, ma'am. State your name and the question from the person.
I'm Mackenzie, and this is for James. Well, as was astutely put, suffering does equal to character development and a person to grow. But why would you try to bring kids with disabilities and kids who get abused like I have been and try to put them as the only point in your conversation against whole human suffering?
That's a great question. So one of the things that I learned in watching debates, as I said, I've never been a part of a debate, so I had to horribly watch a bunch of debates, including some with Eugene. And one of the things I saw is that people try and fight on too many fronts. And so one of the classic tactics of the opponent is to just get you fighting a battle everywhere. Let's talk about vaccines and tornadoes. Let's talk about tsunamis and the Holocaust. And I just thought, let's just go with the one thing that best examples human suffering at its worst. It involves an innocent. It's very difficult to see how there's redemptive good in it. It also involves a loving parent who has power. I felt like it was the perfect vehicle to kind of stick to the point. And sure, there's all kinds of suffering I could have talked about. I have a 16-year-old daughter with cerebral palsy who's basically a quadriplegic and can't care for herself. So I could have talked about that. I know all about that. But I wanted to choose an illustration, an example that would best display the problem. So, and I'm sure at some point I came off as insensitive, and that's me being a jerk at times, and I apologize for that. It's not my intention to be insensitive or to be, I wasn't trying to be sensational. I just really was trying to get through and tackle the idea, how does a good, loving father allow something like that to happen to his child? Give me some reasons. Tell me why that would be reasonable. And I would say that Eugene gave no reasons why any of you would ever allow that to happen to your child, period. None.
Eugene, would you like to respond in a minute and a half?
Sure. I mean, I think, as I said, I don't need to rehash it all. I think that James used a lot of rhetoric, a lot of emotional appeals, and very little argument. But I don't fault you for using the hard example of sexual abuse. And If you're trying to test whether copper conducts electricity, you go with the purest example of copper you can find for the experiment. If you're trying to show that human suffering makes belief in God unreasonable, you go with the most outrageous example of human suffering you can find. That seems entirely reasonable to use that. I just wish you had built on it in a way that led to an argument as opposed to just laying out sad pictures and saying, what are you going to do?
What are you going to do?
All right, we'll move on to the next question. Over here, this gentleman right here. Yes, sir. Say your name and your question for the debater.
Sure. I'm Larry. Real quick point on morality. Relative doesn't necessitate arbitrary. So it seemed like Eugene, you were trying to push James into saying, I have relative morals. That doesn't make them arbitrary.
Sure.
One of the things I didn't understand about your graph, which I think a lot of us were confused about maybe, was you kept saying on theism I at least would expect this, but on atheism I don't expect any of this.
Yeah.
And I think you're taking an affirmative. I think you're taking an affirmative approach.
Okay.
You know, like I'm an atheist, but I'm not an atheist in that, you know, I would affirm. I wouldn't say I can prove that there's no God.
Sure.
You know, and your position on theism was closer to deism. You know, you never, especially with your gap. And I think as an atheist, like sometimes I can vacillate between deism and atheism, depending on the arguments that I'm hearing. But I never, ever can cross the bridge to theism. You know, the gap is huge. And I didn't know why you would choose to attack like an affirmative position of atheism, because I know a lot of atheists. I know very few atheists that take that as a positive position. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that terminology always gets a little tricky because it sounds like you're suggesting that atheism is simply the absence of belief in God.
Yeah, I have no good reason to believe any of these theisms, so I'm an atheist.
But I think that that's a relatively recent innovation in terms of language. Historically speaking, the term atheism refers to an intellectual position which constitutes the denial of God's existence. Otherwise, if you want to go with the neologism, that chair is an atheist because it lacks belief in God. But that seems kind of silly.
The chair is a non-theist, not an atheist.
It doesn't have agency.
The chair is a non-theist.
Well, okay, then a gorilla is an atheist. But I mean, that seems silly. I was using these terms as ways of referring to intellectual positions, to theories. Right? Theism is the theory that God exists. Atheism is the theory that God does not exist.
See, I thought theism was the position of a personal God exists, which is a
theism,
big difference between God
yeah. Theism it's a pretty broad category, and there are subcategories within it. I would say that deism is a subcategory of theism, historically speaking. Now, again, you get on the internet and people try to redefine terms in ways that are kind of sympathetic to their ideology. But definitely there's a difference between classical theism, which would be a kind of more robust, personally involved God, and what we would consider deism, which is more just kind of a standoff, watch, linger, let it go. So yeah, the terminology is a little tricky there sometimes. In my slide, I was using theism and atheism to represent the theory that God exists and the theory that God does not exist.
Okay. So you're using deism and positive atheism.
Using theism in a general sense that would encompass deism and it would potentially encompass other views as well.
James, would you like to respond to anything from that on topic?
Oh, I think we're bored enough.
All right. I'll go back to the gentleman here in the hat in the back. It's like he could beat us all up with his muscles back here. So, yes, sir.
I have a question for James. Actually, I have two, but I don't know if you'll be able to answer. One, has atheism strengthened your family relationships with your children, whoever's part of your family? And two, in your struggle with doubts, what do you do with all the list of answered prayers and miracles? I don't have time to give you the list of, in my experience, people that I know, that only God could be a part of that, and that's not a coincidence. Again, I don't have the time. We can talk in person later. I know it's kind of twofold. First is family,
great question.
and the other one is miracles and prayers answers.
Gotcha. So yeah, no, my becoming an atheist has not been wonderful for my family, but primarily because they've all been indoctrinated to believe that atheists go to hell. Unfortunately, I was the one who indoctrinated them on most of it. I have a sister who laughs at me and says, "You taught them all this crap," and so it's been horrible. I wish it muddles things so badly. It's extremely painful. It's not my belief. It's not my lack of belief anymore that's a problem with my kids. It's the presence of their belief that, you know, dad is now, eating babies, starts his day, sacrificing cats and things. That's just unbelievable, ridiculous. The question of miracles and prayers and things like that, every single religion we could bring in a whole bunch of Muslims that would tell you all of their answered prayers, and we do the same thing with Hindus, the same thing with Jews. Everybody has those same experiences. It's interesting. I asked Eugene, is there anything that could happen today that would cause you to change your position? And he said yes, which is good. I would say too, like right now, we could witness the greatest miracle ever. Wait, you want a miracle? I'll give you a miracle, right?
Give you 30 seconds.
I was in the Muslim world,
Yeah.
and I met Muslims who had visions of Jesus. Muslims who had not even heard the message of Jesus. How can they have a dream about Jesus? How do you explain that?
30 seconds.
Jesus is fairly well known. That's how I explain
No, but
it.
that
Doesn't matter. Everybody, if you're going to make your decisions about faith on the basis of personal experience, then Hinduism is just as valid as Buddhism, is just as valid as Mormonism, is just as valid as Jehovah's Witnesses. And we can trade anecdotes all day long. Here's the thing right now. Look, if God exists, He can do the most amazing miracle right now. He can do the most amazing miracle right now. Because God speaks. He speaks to people. He can create. He can prophesy. Somebody tell me what I had for breakfast, and I swear to you, I talked to my wife this morning. This may be our last
out of
day.
time.
Tell me what I had for breakfast.
Out of time.
I will repent and become a Christian again. Tell me what I had for breakfast.
Thank you. We're out of time.
Anybody?
We're out of time for the debate. That's all the time that we have today. Guys, why don't you give them a round of applause for the debate today? On behalf of the Clay Flat Baptist Association and Midwestern Baptist Seminary, thank you for coming today. I think you could say it's been a spirited debate. Is that about right? I think you got that there. Thank you all for coming so much. James, thank you so much. Eugene, thank you very much. Guys, be safe and go home and have fun the rest of this beautiful day. Thank you for coming.
We'll have to